morning. So I'm back for a third of our 5 weeks on Proverbs. Today we're going to be talking about Proverbs and ancient Near Eastern wisdom. So a bit of a glimpse into the world behind the text and where we can situate Proverbs in terms of other ancient Near Eastern wisdom, especially Egyptian wisdom, which has the closer connections with the book of Proverbs. Since we're talking about the engagement of Israel and her neighbors, and Israel with other cultures around in the ancient Near East, I decided to take this prayer for this morning from the Book of Common Prayer, and it's a prayer for the human family, and about unity in the human family, and so I thought that was fitting with our theme. So please pray with me. O God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love, and work through our struggle and confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that, in your good time, all nations and races may serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. Okay, as usual, I just wanted to do a brief recap of the couple previous weeks that we've talked about, and then a bit of a preview for the next couple. So we're right in the middle of our series right now. The first week we talked about some introductory things about the book of Proverbs, including the figure of Solomon and how we see Solomon figured prominently in the book as a kind of authority figure behind the book. We talked about Solomon's wisdom and the account of him that we see in the book of Kings. But we also talked about how the book goes beyond Solomon himself. So we see references to the Hezekiah's scribes who are copying Solomon's Proverbs. We see references to the words of the wise that we'll be especially looking at that section today. And then later at the end of the book, references to these unknown figures, Agur and Lemuel. So we can see that the book is kind of meant to go beyond Solomon, and just in terms of history, probably came together over a long period of time. We also talked about how the structure of the book takes students through a kind of wisdom journey, through a beginning levels of knowledge to more intermediate and then advanced. And the idea is that the wisdom student is supposed to grow in wisdom as they read the book and probably continue reading it and grow at any level where they are. Last week we talked about wealth and poverty, and I was trying to use this as a way to just think about how we read and interpret Proverbs, what the truth of Proverbs is. So we saw the general trend that I think many of us are familiar with, the linking between wealth and wisdom. So people who are wise / righteous / hard workers will be wealthy. We see that in many of the Proverbs. But then we also saw that paradigm kind of complicated through various ways. So we talked about how sometimes there's bad wealth, ill-gotten gain is consistently looked down upon. There's a lot of things about how wisdom is better than wealth. And then there's a lot of messages about care for the poor, which if we just had a very straightforward, wisdom and righteousness equals wealth, then we would think you could flip that and, poor person is got to be foolish or wicked. But we actually don't see that equation. And it's much more complicated, and there's a consistent ethic of care for the poor in the book of Proverbs. And so we talked about how the Proverbs you can't necessarily pick up a proverb out and just read it as a kind of universal promise or a guarantee or something like that. We have to see it within the context of the book of Proverbs, and we need wisdom to know how and when to apply Proverbs. And I think that's very obvious to me in terms of Proverbs as a genre, but I think it's actually true for a lot of biblical texts that we need to see where and how biblical texts apply. We can't necessarily just grab a verse and just use it universally. And sometimes some work better than others in those cases, but usually it requires wisdom and discernment. So today we'll look at Proverbs and ancient Near Eastern wisdom. Next week, one of my favorite topics, humor in Proverbs, and the way that humor is used to develop this really important theme of humility. And then lastly, women in wisdom, which is something we've already touched on, but we'll especially look at that the last text in the book, the Proverbs 31 woman. As always, feel free to talk to me if you have questions, or email me if you have things you especially want covered. I'm always happy to hear from people. The question that I've been asking every week, that I've hoping we're all reflecting on, and I am as well, during Lent, is what does wisdom look like in my everyday life? What is wisdom for us as we, go about our day interacting with our families, our friends, at work, in our community, our political system? What does it mean to be wise, and how do we gain wisdom, and how do we live with wisdom? A couple sub-questions here as we're going to be talking about this, what looks like an example of the Bible incorporating wisdom from another culture and another context. I think this can provide a model for us to think about how we find wisdom, where we find wisdom from outside the Christian tradition, what can we learn from that? What could we learn from putting the Bible into conversation with other traditions and other sources of wisdom? So that's kind of something I hope to return to at the end today. So I'll say a couple just general things about wisdom, kind of wisdom perspectives in the Bible and the ancient Near East, how wisdom literature was written and developed in these contexts, and then we'll look at a specific example on your handout of what looks like a particularly close relationship between Proverbs and the Egyptian text, the instruction of Amen Mobe. So that's what we've got for us today. All right, in terms of wisdom in the ancient world, let's say a caveat at first, which is that when people talk about wisdom as a genre, that's been pushed back a lot on in biblical studies, and when you talk about ancient Near Eastern texts as well. We can't necessarily just say there's one genre that's called wisdom, and certain books are in it, and certain books are out of it, whether we're talking about the Bible or the ancient Near East. A lot of people, when we talk about biblical literature, the wisdom books are Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. And I think that's actually a fairly good designation, but it's also a kind of a genre designation imposed from the outside. We don't necessarily have people in ancient Israel thinking in terms of wisdom literature versus, legal texts, or wisdom literature versus prophecy, or wisdom literature versus lament or something. And we can see kind of interactions between all of these. Also true in other cultures, Egyptian, Mesopotamian texts. I think what we do clearly see in especially Egypt, that there's a kind of instructional genre. There's texts that are instructional, that have particularly close connections with the book of Proverbs. And then there are also some other texts that, especially in Egypt and also Mesopotamia, that we see connections with Job and Ecclesiastes. But there's not necessarily one genre that we call wisdom, and compare that to other wisdom texts. There's just an interplay among different kinds of texts. But we do see some similarities in terms of concepts, content of the text, form of the text, and between what we see in the Bible and other ancient Near Eastern cultures. So, for example, across Egypt, Israel, Mesopotamia, wisdom and the created order are closely linked, and that we saw that really in Proverbs 8 with this idea of wisdom being present with God at creation. Wisdom is interwoven into creation in this really close way, and maybe that's why we saw the text in Kings of Solomon teaching about birds and plants and things like that we might call science. There's no division in the ancient world between, like wisdom on the one hand, science on the other hand. All of this is integrated. And in terms of social structure, the king is integrated in that whole system too. So order is very important. Wisdom is important for maintaining order. And the king is really closely related to often to the God or the gods, and responsible for maintaining that order with wisdom. We see that really across a lot of the literature. In these texts, we have a lot of the similar topics addressed, and this shouldn't be surprising. A lot of it is just about, getting along in life, practical concerns, like things about work, about money, about women, because most of these texts, not all of them, but most of them, have a kind of men as the authors and the implied audience. Things about friends and associates. There's a lot about speech, and when to speak, when to be silent, controlling your speech, and many other topics that you can see in common across this literature. A particular point that people often draw comparisons between the Bible and the book of Proverbs is with this Egyptian concept of Ma'at, which is a concept but also a goddess, and she's often represented with an ostrich feather, like in this picture, or as an ostrich feather. The Ma'at, it's hard to translate, but it draws on concepts of truth, justice, harmony, balance, wisdom. All of these things together are Ma'at, and she's a figure that is sometimes compared to the figure of wisdom, Chokmah in Hebrew, especially what we see in Proverbs 1 through 9 with this personified wisdom figure. They're not exactly the same, and we don't see wisdom in the Bible as, and most people don't consider her to be a goddess. She's close to God. She's sometimes thought of as an attribute, a kind of personified attribute of God, but she's not a god in her own right, whereas in Egypt, eventually there are temples and things dedicated to her, so she's a goddess alongside other gods and goddesses. But sometimes people make the connection, and certainly people do personify traits like wisdom in the ancient world, and that's similar in the Bible. You get these, as I said, instructional collections and proverb collections, both in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, starting very ancient times. So I think the first one, or one of the first that we have, are these Sumerian instructions, the Sumerian instruction of Shuruppak, which is from about 2500 maybe, 2500 BC. So that's the third millennium, long before we have any biblical literature. We have like a Sumerian proverb collection. We also have Egyptian proverb collection or instructional collections from the third millennium, the instruction of Merikari, the instruction of Tahotep. So again, these are third millennium, older than any biblical material. So if you remember, David, so Abraham is living sometime around 2000, and then David, and then Solomon, that's around 1000, and on. So Solomon's reign is in the 900s, the 10th century. So some of this literature is much older than biblical literature, but it continues to be copied. We see texts that are from the third millennium copied in later times in Egypt, and new texts being written in the second millennium and into the first millennium. So this kind of instructional literature genre really, spans hundreds and hundreds of years across all of these cultures, and older texts are reused in newer texts, and older texts continue to be copied, and so we see it from a bunch of different times. Any questions or comments before we go on, Bruce?
Would a Hebrew scribe or a learned person have studied Egyptian and Sumerian texts?
That's a great question. Would a Hebrew scribe have studied Egyptian or Sumerian texts? I'll get there. They're maybe not in Egyptian, but they might have had. It's reasonable to think they would have had contact with at least some of these texts or familiarity. So yes, I will get to that point. Wisdom and this kind of instructional literature is often tied in these cultures to scribal schools. We're not quite sure in ancient Israel whether there were schools exactly, probably around the administration of the government, the palace and the temple. There would have been some kind of scribal apparatus and people learning to write and read and copying texts. But definitely we do see this kind of thing in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. And these points come from a commentary by Bernd Schipper, one of the recent commentaries on Proverbs, about kind of how wisdom and these texts were developed in scribal schools. One point that's interesting that he notes is that what he calls educative wisdom, which is more of the practical stuff like rules for behavior, ethical sayings, the kind of stuff really that's most of the book of Proverbs, and cosmotheistic knowledge, which would be more esoteric knowledge about how the cosmos operates. So kind of practical on the one side, and then these bigger metaphysical kind of wisdom and knowledge. They're closely connected in a lot of the texts. So whereas we might think some of this wisdom in the book of Proverbs about your everyday life and how you talk and what kind of woman you marry and stuff is a little different from this kind of cosmic knowledge. We actually see both in the book of Proverbs and and both in biblical wisdom and literature in general. And that's true of Egypt and Mesopotamia, that these things are connected in literature. It seems to be the case that a lot of this literature, it was passed down in scribal or temple schools. So scribal students would use these texts to learn, writing, but also to learn wisdom. So they would copy the text, instructional text, and also probably internalize it, memorize them in a lot of cases, copy them. And as they kind of grow in wisdom and knowledge, then they might, and a more advanced kind of a scribal student might be able to write their own text. And so we see sometimes they take things that they've memorized, things that they've learned, and you see those in other texts incorporated or related things. They'll take a proverb and change it a bit and add new ones. And we kind of see this dynamic when you compare texts across time. That's kind of how scribal education works. And it's interesting when we look at what a lot of people see as the use of this instruction of Amen and Mope in the book of Proverbs, that a scribe may have used this text just like Egyptian scribes are using their own literature to kind of draw from it and create something new. That might be what's going on in Proverbs as well, that the author of Proverbs is also using a wisdom text, but also making it their own composition and a new thing. Also in these traditions, we see that this kind of educative wisdom, rules for behavior, ethical sayings, practical wisdom, it doesn't stop. Like there's not like a static wisdom tradition that people just kind of say, okay, this is the wisdom, and we leave it there. There's often a kind of critical questioning of traditions. And we see that a bit in Proverbs. We'll see that next week with the humor piece and Proverbs 30. But we also see it in Ecclesiastes and Job, the way that those books interact with the book of Proverbs, that there's a kind of dynamic between kind of traditional wisdom and then questioning, what happens if there's an exception to this, wisdom-wealth connection, for example. And that's true in the ancient Near East as well. So all of these dynamics we can see pretty clearly in Egypt and Mesopotamian texts and also part of the Bible. A similar thing, even though we don't have a lot of evidence in terms of what actually scribal education would have looked like in ancient Israel at least. So to get to Bruce's question, is it reasonable to think that an Israelite scribe might have known some of these texts and traditions from other places? Sometimes we actually do find texts, but that's pretty rare. There is a Mesopotamian text that's often classified as wisdom called Akhbar that was found in the Jewish community in Elephantine in Egypt. So sometimes we do find actual texts, but we don't usually. But from what we know from how Israel and Judah related to their neighbors, it is reasonable to think that some of these traditions would have been familiar to them. So first of all, we really don't have any evidence for this outside of the Bible, but in the Bible, we hear that the Israelites lived in Egypt for a long time, and so they were there, and some people, like Moses, was growing up in the Egyptian court, may have, some close knowledge of Egyptian traditions. And then Egypt had a presence in Canaan. Egypt basically controlled the land of Canaan in this time, kind of right before Israel came into the land in the late Bronze Age. There were city-states controlled by other rulers, but Egypt kind of had the main control of the land. So there may have been kind of remnants of, Egyptian culture left from that time period, and sometimes we do see iconographic things, images and stuff from Egypt. I showed you last week, we talked about wealth in Israel, and you saw that the palace in Samaria had those ivories, and one of the ivories is the winged sphinx figure. That's an Egyptian image. So you definitely see Egyptian cultural influence in various ways. According to the Bible, this is another one we don't have a lot of extra biblical evidence for, but according to the Bible, during Solomon's reign, Solomon made an alliance with the Pharaoh in Egypt. Not totally clear who that was, and married that Pharaoh's daughter. He also is said to have imported horses and chariots from Egypt, which the biblical authors don't like that, but So we do see this close relationship in Solomon's time, and so reasonable to think that, texts and traditions could have come into Israel during the 10th century with Solomon's relationship with Egypt. And then later in the 8th and 7th centuries, there is quite a bit of evidence for this interaction with Egypt during Hezekiah's and Josiah's reign, and we saw in the book of Proverbs it mentions Hezekiah's men copying the Proverbs. This seems to be a time of increasing scribal activity, time when a lot of the biblical literature could have been written. And we do have contact between them in 2 Kings. At one point, Judah is becoming a vassal state to Egypt and paying them for their support. We also know from the book of Isaiah that Israel appealed to Egypt to help them against the Assyrians. This was a time that the Assyrians were really bearing down on them and a threat, and so sometimes Israel appealed to Egypt to help them with that. And so we also know with this particular text that I'm going to talk about, the instruction of Amenemope, it's an older Egyptian text, but it was copied during the 7th century. We have Egyptian copies from that time. And so probably in terms of influence, if this text did come into Judah during that time, probably at some point it was translated into Aramaic from Egyptian. So Aramaic was the lingua franca of that part of the world for a time, and so it's reasonable to think that the text could have been translated into Aramaic. So not necessarily that the Israelite, Judahite scribes knew Egyptian, but that if it was translated into Aramaic, brought into Israel, that somebody could have been working from an Aramaic copy of the text. But also there's, there's also a dynamic between written and oral traditions as well. Some things might have been orally transmitted. Who knows how that would have happened exactly, but that's also a possibility. So it's probably not the case that Israelite scribes, knew whole libraries of Egyptian or Mesopotamian texts necessarily, but reasonable to think probably that they could have had some contact with some of these influential texts. Okay, so we're going to look particularly at this instruction of Amenemope that I mentioned. It's an Egyptian instructional text that people think was written during the Ramesside period. So many people think Ramses II was the pharaoh of the Exodus when Israel left Egypt. So the text, we don't have copies of the text from this time, but scholars nevertheless date the text to this time. So this would predate Solomon, for example. We have, I think the only full version of the text probably comes from the 7th century. But there are various copies. So we can see that this text was influential, copied over hundreds of years, and used in scribal training in Egypt, for example. The text takes the form of 30 chapters, and it mentions at the end of the text the 30 chapters or 30 sayings about that make up this wisdom. The big themes in it are responsibilities of officials, behavior of a person before their superiors, restraint in speech, self-control, and trust in the deity. Various Egyptian deities are mentioned, but a lot of times the text just says God or the God, and it seems to be the case that people could, not necessarily that this is a monotheistic text, but that people could kind of plug in their own deity into this when they're thinking about which deity they're trusting in. So this text, since its discovery, people have noticed many strong parallels in the book of Proverbs, and it's not only in this one section that we'll look at, but in various places in the book of Proverbs you see close connections. But there's really a big cluster of close connections in Proverbs 22:17 to 23:11. This is the part that is often called the words of the wise, and seems to have a kind of a heading relating it to the words of the wise. According to Michael Fox, a scholar who has done some of the most work on this text, he finds that 15 verses in this section out of 24 have strong parallels with Amenemope. He says 2 more have kind of thematic parallels, and 7 verses have no connection at all. That's his reckoning. Other people might disagree what constitutes a strong parallel or not, but he sees a very close connection. At the same time, this section of Proverbs is much shorter than the instruction of Amen and Mope, and if you look at how much of the text might have been used, it's only about 10% of the instruction of Amen and Mope that Fox would say shows up in the book of Proverbs. So what I want to do is, on your handout, I lined up some of these texts that Fox and others have identified as close parallels. We'll look at the first one together, the beginning of this, and then I'll let you look at some of the other ones with people sitting near you. So if, does anyone need a handout? There's some extras here. Okay, so I'll read this first section from Proverbs 22, 17 to 21, and this has a few connections with a text towards the beginning of the instruction of Amen and Mope. So Proverbs 22 says, "Incline your ear and hear the words of the wise." This isn't as obvious of a heading as some of them in Proverbs, like, the Proverbs of Solomon, but many people think this is the start of a new section in Proverbs, especially because a little bit later there is a heading that says, "These are more words of the wise." So it seems like this is the first words of the wise collection, and then we have more words of the wise and a little bit longer. So this is a new section. "Incline your ear and hear the words of the wise, and direct your heart to my knowledge. For it will be pleasant if you keep them in your belly," which is often translated differently in English, but that's what it literally says. "That they may be all secure on your lips, in order that your trust may be in the Lord. I have taught them to you, even you today. Have I not written for you 30 sayings of counsel and knowledge, to teach you the truest words, that you might give a true answer to those who send you?" This thing about the 30, it's a little bit of a textual issue in Hebrew, and requires a bit of an emendation to get to the 30. Just the word is unclear in Hebrew, seems to relate to 3 or 30. Other translations you might see it's noble things or excellent things. That's also a bit of a stretch. But the 30 is very interesting because Amen and Mope also has 30 chapters. And here in Proverbs, if you look at this section, people often divide it into about 30. It's not totally clear-cut that there are 30 pieces of instruction, but some people can get 30-ish, 29, 31. So this is, like I said, it's a bit of a textual problem, but the 30 sayings reading is, I think, a reasonable deduction for what this means. It's interesting, this is the only reference to the wisdom giver writing knowledge in Proverbs. So, "Have I not written for you 30 sayings?" Which is just kind of interesting. In the rest of the book of Proverbs, we don't see the wisdom person depicted as writing. Read.
Just curious, in the line that says, "I have taught them to you, even you today."
Yeah, that's also unusual.
Is it?
Well,
I don't know.
What was your question?
Why the redundancy, or like even you?
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure. It definitely is emphatic in a way that we do have this second person address in a lot of Proverbs, especially the beginning of Proverbs, the father speaking to the son, for example, which is actually another thing that's very common in the Egyptian text, is the model of a father and a son, which isn't always supposed to be understood literally as a father and a son. Sometimes it's just a model for any kind of wisdom teacher or scribal teacher to a student. So that the second person address is not unusual, but the you, even you, is definitely, in Hebrew, it is redundant, and it seems to be emphatic for that reason. I'm not sure the reason for that. Is it supposed to be, that every wisdom student really is supposed to hear this? This isn't just, you need to be paying attention to this. In particular, if you've fallen asleep by this point in the book, this is for you, and not, so I'm not sure the reason for emphasis. Anybody else could chime in if they have a thought about that. But it definitely is kind of maybe waking someone up. This is really for you. I don't think it's meant to be for one person. I don't think we need to kind of try to uncover some original context where there's one guy that really is supposed to hear this, because that's not how this literature seems to work. But there is really the point being made is like, yes, you need to listen to this, and there is some emphasis on that. So if you look across the way at the Amenemope text, and just look at this as I read it and see if you can notice some connections. So this is towards the beginning of the text of Amenemope. It says, "Give your ears that you may hear the things that are said. Apply your heart to interpret them. Putting them in your heart is beneficial, but they are a woe to him that ignores them. Make them rest in the casket of your belly. Lock them up in your heart. When there is a storm of words, they will be a mooring post for your tongue." So that's towards the beginning. The last line that I included is in the epilogue of the text. It says, "Look to these 30 chapters, they will give you wisdom," etc. But I just wanted to point out that if that 30 reading is correct in Proverbs, you also have, it's clearly a collection of 30 sayings in Amenemope. Does anybody notice some similar things or have questions? Dean?
I find it very fascinating to have the nautical allusion.
Oh, yeah.
And I wonder if that goes back to the fact that the sea is considered to be an enemy, and for the Hebrews, it definitely was
Yeah.
an enemy. But for the Egyptians, it seems as though they are more adaptable to the sea and everything there. But I do find it striking and wish that it was in the Proverbs.
Yeah, it's interesting that you have the idea of something kind of being secure, the idea of the words are supposed to be secure on your lips in Proverbs, but it's not exactly the same as the nautical metaphor in Amenemope. When there's a storm of words, there will be a mooring post for your tongue, which is a pretty vivid metaphor, not taken over into Proverbs. And you're right that the sea is seen as often this place of chaos for Israel, which would seem to be relevant here, but also maybe Israelites aren't as seafaring of a people, it's true that the Nile in Egypt is this source of life, and it's a very regular in a way that in Mesopotamia and Canaan they don't have such a regular like water giving of life type of thing as the Nile. So that is interesting.
So, like Dean, I'm struck by something that is different here, but also related. The casket of your belly. I mean, when I see the word casket, I associate it with death. Is this the sort of casket into which one might put treasures, or is this to be associated with death?
Yeah, that's a great question too. Michael Fox said that he thinks it's related to a special kind of box that people put papyrus scrolls in. So it may be casket. In that case, it would be better to say like box or storage vessel, treasure chest or something. So if they are, especially if they're storing wisdom, instructional papyrus scrolls in a special box, then he's saying internalize that box. You see in Proverbs and I think elsewhere in the Bible this idea of writing wisdom on the tablet of your heart, and I think that's something you see in other ancient Near Eastern literature as well. So I think it's kind of the same thing. You write it on the tablet of your heart, so you're internalizing that external thing, and here make him rest in the casket of your belly. If the Israelite or Judahite author is using this, they might not have that same practice of the box of papyrus scrolls, which may be why it just says keep them in your belly, and not the box in your belly. Yes, Dean?
I've been thinking a lot about the difference between heart theology and head theology, that our Western civilization's mental categories and so forth have contributed to the division of churches. And here you've got the belly. Paul speaks of the bowels of mercy. And so I'm wondering how you take that, putting them in your heart, and the casket of your belly. That's something different than the mind. That's adoration rather than rationalization.
Yeah, Yeah, I think that, I mean, and the organs are have different associations sometimes in the Bible than ours. So I would say the heart has some cognitive overlap with what we give the mind or the brain in the Bible. And the belly, we don't see that come up so much, but definitely the kidneys are organs associated with emotion in the Bible. So whereas we might put emotion with the heart, cognitive thinking with the brain. The heart in a way is a cognitive, the seat of cognitive power in the Bible, but it might also overlap with the emotional heart that we have. We have a couple more comments. Yeah.
No, I was just thinking even nowadays we talk about take this advice to heart.
Yeah.
So it's totally faith in a way.
Mm-hmm. Bruce.
I was just going to say use the word internalize, and that sort of encompasses all of that.
Right.
Mind, heart, spirit.
Right. Yeah.
And I find it interesting that in contrast, we specifically have in Proverbs, they call out that you may trust in the Lord. Like that's
Yeah.
kind of the end
Right.
of this wisdom, and that's not really in this other paragraph.
Right. Yeah, I think it in this, yeah, it does set it apart. I think in this part of the text it's not there, but there is, as I said, this idea of trust in the deity in this text and other places. It is interesting that, yeah, it is fronted up here, and it's specifically the Lord, Yahweh, the name of Israel's God. That's emphasized here. But yeah, I do think that internalization, I think in general, no matter how we kind of parse what each organ does in the Bible or for us, there probably isn't as much division as we would see in terms of like, rational knowledge, head knowledge, brain knowledge, and like emotions, sometimes that we've separated. I think you can see kind of aspects of that in the Bible, but probably not as differentiated as we would have. And the important thing is the internalization of this, not only on a cognitive level, but like on a whole body level, which is probably a useful model for us as well. Why don't we take just, 8 minutes or so, and you can look at whatever others, there's 4 other texts here that you can compare. You can start wherever you want. Just kind of look at them next to each other with somebody you're sitting next to, and just see what you notice in terms of similarities or differences. So just take a look at this for the next few minutes and see what you notice in terms of connections or distinctions. Like I said, you can start on the front, you can go to the back where there's some longer ones.
Mind giving me a few minutes? And we go gone. It's a lot to digest.
take a look at these together and see what you noticed. Anyone want to chime in something that they noticed here? Similar or different?
Lots more detail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Amenemope is longer, more detailed. It's just a longer text in general, and I think I tried to put kind of the whole unit so you can see not just parallels, but how much longer it is.
The Amenemope indicates a much more structured society where the ranks of people, whereas the Proverbs leave that part alone and indicates a somewhat more free society.
Yeah, that's a great point. That Amenemope looks like it's reflecting a certain social structure that's not necessarily reflected in Proverbs. And Amenemope does seem more focused on a particular context of a courtier, a scribe, somebody working in a royal court, which you see sometimes in the book of Proverbs. Sometimes you do see advice about, this is how you should behave before a king. But you also have times when the Proverbs looks like it's like a general statement versus a specific social context in Amenemope. So, for example, the second text here, Amenemope 11, says, "Do not associate with a heated man or approach him for conversation. Preserve your tongue from answering your superior, and beware of insulting him." So it's really specifically about how you behave before your superior, whereas the thematically similar, at least one in Proverbs, about not associating with a hot-tempered man, is about, it could be any context. It doesn't necessarily have to be the superior, so that's a great point.
Maybe piggybacking on that, even though I agree with Levon, it seems to me one of the benefits of doing this, and I'm so grateful to you for drawing us into this, is to illuminate the degree to which we worship a living God. And for example, Proverbs 22, is it 18? And on the other side of the sheet, the presence of their Redeemer
Yeah.
is in striking contrast to the Egyptian. We are shaped through the Hebrew Bible and through the New Testament to see both in creation and in every day of our lives the presence of the Lord.
Yeah.
And there seems to be, on the Egyptian side, less confidence that we're held in the hollow of his hand.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you to a certain extent that obviously we still have the same, Redeemer who's the defender of the orphans in Proverbs 23, and I think that's a really strongly stated text that's still relevant. I mean, in the Amenemope, I think the parallel is in the last line, the person who's cheating on the fields will be caught by the powers of the moon. That's the Egyptian god of Thoth. So it's different, and it's a different god mentioned, but I do think they see that some kind of, that this god, the moon god, is going to be defending the field of the orphan in this case, right, or the widow. The widow. And so, yeah, I think there's a parallel, but I do think, you could see a difference as well.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the fields of orphans?
Yeah. So for one thing, I guess there's a slight difference in terms of what's going on in the Egyptian context and what's going on in the biblical context. Both of them, you see that the fields are marked with stones. I guess you don't see this, the boundary. We do have other places in the Bible where you're not supposed to move the boundary stone, and that's in biblical legal text as well. So the fields are marked with stones. You see that in the Egyptian text, but they also have a measuring cords. And I guess what would happen in Egypt is that every year after the flooding of the Nile receded, then they would have to kind of remark out the fields, which is something that wouldn't have had to happen in Israel. And so in Egypt, scribes were kind of employed in this marking and recording of the fields. And Amenemope, actually, in the beginning of the text, identifies himself as a scribe who fixes the borders of the fields and makes the land register of Egypt. So this guy who's writing the text is personally one of these scribes who is working on the fields registry. And you can see that for somebody out doing this job in Egypt, they might have been tempted to take a bribe from somebody to, move that stone or that cord a little bit. And so that seems to be what he's especially guarding against in that context, is a scribe who's fudging the field markers. Whereas in the biblical text, seems like they didn't have that same practice. So it's probably anybody who's trying to move those stones to get more property. I think the orphans, so orphans and widows are, of course, in the Bible, common categories of people who are outside the context, the safety of like the patriarchal household, but still seemingly could inherit land. And so, but they might not have had the same, it might have just been harder for them, especially if the orphan is a minor child. They might have inherited land that's in their family, but they don't have the same defenses if somebody's trying to take that land. In the book of Ruth, it seems like Naomi has a field. She's a widow, so she has this field. But again, you'd think she would be more vulnerable to somebody moving those stones around, trying to take the field, than somebody who has a strong patriarch leader in their household. And this is in Exodus as well, the idea in legal text, the idea that widows and orphans, they don't have anybody to defend them, so God is their special defender. And God, outside of even the legal system, and this is true even in Exodus, will defend them. They have a special defender in God. And it may be, as Bill is arguing, a kind of stronger role for God than what we see in the Egyptian text. But at the same time, there's still an idea that you shouldn't be messing around with somebody's property and taking it, especially vulnerable people.
In this one, on Proverbs 23,
Mm-hmm.
where Redeemer is strong,
Yeah.
is that an allusion to the kinsman Redeemer?
Yeah, I think so. That's so the kinsman redeemer in the Bible is a human figure who kind of protects the safety and integrity of the family. So kinsman redeemer could be buying somebody back from slavery. They could be avenging the death of their relative. That's the blood redeemer. And also buying land to keep the land in their family. So yes, I think the metaphor is based in that idea of the human family redeemer who keeps the family together and protects the vulnerable members of their family. And this is saying, this seems to be saying that God is there, because they might not have a human redeemer to help them, so God is their redeemer. Jason?
Yeah, I'm gonna try to correct my voice. Come off cold. How do you help us understand the distinction between like a literary connection?
Yeah.
And as we mentioned, a lot of this is the creative order. This is just like how the world works.
Right.
So we should expect some parallels. So if you talk to fishermen off the coast here, they would probably have some of the same wisdom and advice as
Yeah.
fishermen in Greece.
Right.
But we wouldn't necessarily say, oh, we were borrowing. So how do we
Right.
move beyond just general, that's the way a world works, to
Yeah.
a literary?
So that's a great question. Jason's asking, how do we distinguish between actual literary borrowing versus these are common traditions? Of course, that's a debate, and some people would push back against the idea that the biblical author actually knew a literary text on Mount and used it, and some would say that it's just a coincidence and they just have common concepts here. I think it's hard to prove. It's a cumulative case for me in terms of when you talk about just a tradition versus literature. I think with this case, I gave you some, but there's more examples. And as Fox has pointed out, it's a concentrated part of Proverbs that shows the most connections with this text. Clearly, if it is a literary borrowing, the guy's not just copying it out, word for word. It's engaging in it in a different way. But you do have just this density, I think, of parallels and things that I think if you took one example, another example, the hot-tempered man, for example, of course, like a lot of people could give you that advice, don't associate with a hot-tempered man. But like the wealth one, do not strain to get rich in Proverbs, and the idea that if wealth, you look to its place, it is no more, it sprouted wings like an eagle and flown away. Across the way in Amenemope, it's a much longer, and it also talks about ill-gotten wealth, but the idea that you don't cast your heart after wealth. In the middle it says, their place is seen, but they're no longer, so the same image like, oh, that's where the wealth is, but it's not there anymore. And then at the bottom, they've made themselves wings like a goose and flown away. You have a goose there. Jonathan and I were trying to think if there are any geese in the Bible. We couldn't think of any in the Old Testament. So maybe they see eagles more than they see geese in Egypt. But anyway, yeah, I mean, you can argue that, okay, the idea of wealth becoming like a bird and flying away, people in two different contexts could have thought of that. That's definitely true. But I think when you, in this one particular text, if you get this density of parallels, and if you accept the reading at the beginning of the 30 sayings, I think that's a pretty distinctive connection. So, I mean, it's possible that, it's also possible that the biblical author knows a different form of Amenemope than the one we have. It's also possible that the biblical author and Amenemope, they know some common text that we don't have anymore. So I don't necessarily think that the biblical author necessarily had this text in the one extant form that we have it, that our translations are from it, and you know he's working from that. I think it's hard to say like what the exact influence is, but to me, if there's a density of parallels and they're close enough, it argues for literary dependence.
On the question of literary borrowing,
Yeah.
it seems to me that, I don't know if this is true of ancient culture, but certainly in our culture, there's this common fund of knowledge that comes from lots of different sources, and
Yeah.
we're constantly recontextualizing it and spinning it in a different direction. And I can think of tons of examples, but one in particular jumped to mind, and that is Thomas Merton, who drew very heavily on Vedic wisdom and on Zen Buddhism.
Yeah.
And he incorporated it into a distinctly an Orthodox Christian understanding. But he saw the wisdom there. And so why wouldn't others in the ancient world, if they see something, yeah, that's true.
Right.
In fact, I like that image of a bird flying away.
Yeah.
You know?
And what I think is interesting here, if we do accept that there's some kind of direct influence in this, is that it gives us kind of one model out of several that we see in terms of biblical engagement with other traditions outside of Israel. So, for example, if you look at creation stories, I think many of you are familiar with the text like the Babylonian Enuma Elish, where you have like this battle among the gods, it's very gory, and all the gods are fighting each other, and creation kind of comes out of that context. When you look at the biblical account alongside those, you see certain points of connection, even in certain vocabulary that's used. But the biblical account is so different in terms of, God, one God being so in control, ordering everything in this very ordered way, that it looks like there may be an implicit polemic against the Babylonian text. That's kind of one model I see of that engagement, that probably the author of Genesis 1 is familiar with that model and those traditions, but chooses, deliberately makes this look different. Whereas in this case, we see differences, and I agree there are differences, but in terms of kind of overall perspective, it's largely the same, and just like Egyptians could kind of plug a god name in or out, that the biblical author can as well, kind of take it over without actually, I don't think, much of a polemic. I mean, there's adjustments to the context and the differences, but it's not the same as the Genesis one. And so I think, in Bruce's example of Thomas Merton using Vedic traditions, it's that may be even more of a change that he's adapting them. But we have just these different models in the Bible of how other traditions, neighboring traditions, were used, and I think it actually does provide an interesting and maybe helpful model for us in thinking through. And this is my last thing, in terms of when we see wisdom outside of our traditions, outside of the Bible, outside the church. It could be other religions like Buddhism. And practices, like mindfulness meditation, things like that come out of Buddhism. It could be in art or literature, and there's in philosophy. There's so many places we could get wisdom. And I think, as Christians, I do think seeing a model like this helps us. It kind of gives us warrant to find wisdom in other places outside of our tradition. But we also need to apply wisdom in order to know what we adapt, what we take, what we change, and what we reject from those other traditions. And so that's just, I think, a great point and something I would like to leave you with. We're at time, so if you want to talk more, come talk to me, but thank you. Next time we'll be talking about humor and humility, so I look forward to seeing you next week.